Today, I'll be looking at another Go Tanabe adaptation of an H.P. Lovecraft story. This one is the titular story of H.P. Lovecraft's The Hound and Other Stories, a collection of 3 stories adapted by Go Tanabe. The Hound is another fairly early Lovecraft short story, being written in 1922 and published in Weird Tales magazine in 1924. So it was actually published before the first story of this collection, The Temple, despite being written later. H.P. Lovecraft apparently came up with the idea for this story after a visit to Brooklyn with a friend of his. While there, they came across an old Dutch graveyard dating back to the early 18th century. Lovecraft took a chip off an old tombstone as a souvenir, which I guess wasn't too weird of a thing to do back then. Back in his hometown of Providence, he thought about if something might come out of the grave to avenge itself for his act of desecration. Thus, this story was born. Let's get started. Our setting is in England, in either the early 20th century or late 19th century. I'm thinking the latter, based on the fashion. Our narrator, who is not named in either the original story or the adaptation, seeks to provide some explanation for a monstrous fate that has befallen him and his friend. The narrator and his friend, St. John, which apparently was also the nickname of that friend Lovecraft visited the graveyard with, are a pair of well-off young men that live together in a manor. Having become quite bored of normal pastimes, they've taken up some rather morbid habits. They sought novelty through the study of esoteric and gruesome art. In plumbing the depths of this interest, they began to crave the stimulation of direct personal experience of the unnatural, which they did through the abhorred practice of grave robbing. So yes, these two are into grave robbing purely for the aesthetic and have amassed a grisly collection of plundered art and human remains stowed away in a room of their house. Aren't these two so relatable and normal? They also enjoy reading passages from the Necronomicon, which they have a copy of and is an occult book filled with forbidden knowledge. St. John bemoans that they don't have a copy of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred's original, instead an English translation by John Dee, who was a real occultist and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. The Necronomicon is a common recurring element in Lovecraft stories, and has been referenced in many other works since, though amusingly this adaptation seems to have taken cues for what it looks like from the Evil Dead films. This story is apparently the very first Lovecraft story to make any mention of the book. One day, as St. John and the narrator are drinking tea and reading from the Necronomicon, St. John suggests another dig. He's heard word of a tempting target, a man laid to rest in Holland some 5 centuries ago, known to have been a grave robber like them. Supposedly, he stole something potent from a mighty sepulchre. They plan to visit under the light of the full moon, and our narrator is very excited. The narrator and St. John cross the channel to the Netherlands on the next full moon and, with a shovel and a shotgun, make their way to the secluded graveyard. Along the way, they are haunted by the sound of a distant howling. A wolf or feral dog appears, and St. John levels his gun at it. St. John takes this time to reveal that, according to the stories of the local peasantry, the man whose grave they are to plunder was said to have been found ripped to pieces by the teeth and nails of a great beast. He squeezes the trigger and the dog slumps to the ground. The narrator is concerned someone might have heard the gunshot, but St. John assures him that even if someone hears it, nobody will come. These graves have been long forsaken. They find the grave and begin to dig. The narrator hears the distant howling of a great beast. St. John dismisses it as another dog, but the narrator thinks it's something else. to which St. John jokes that maybe the beast has returned to its old victim, which does not lighten the narrator's mood much. They pry open the coffin, and the occupant is reasonably well preserved for someone that's been in the ground for 5 centuries. Some of his wounds are still visible. They are drawn to something worn around his neck, a jade figurine of a winged beast. St. John calls it an amulet. He also references the Necronomicon. A winged hound is described here as a symbol of the corpse-eating cult of Lang. In this shape manifest those souls that vexed and gnawed at the dead. Despite his earlier apprehension, the narrator seems quite pleased by this result, saying it was worth the trip. Okay, the elephant in the room here is that Go Tanabe very clearly depicted the figurine as a winged lion, not a hound. In the original story, it is a little ambiguous. Lovecraft described it as a crouched winged hound or sphinx with a semi-canine face. So I'm guessing that Go Tanabe leaned into the sphinx side of that description. However, I'm at loss that someone would look at this and think, oh, it's a hound. In any case, the 2 grave robbers closed the coffin, filled in the grave, and returned to England with their prize. As they embark and contemplate their next dig, however, the narrator is unnerved by a distant howling. St. John appeared not to have heard it. Back in England, they set up the figurine as the centerpiece of their morbid collection. Less than a week later, strange things begin to happen. One night, while drinking tea and perusing the Necronomicon, as one does, an unseen shadow passes the narrator's window. When he looks, there is nothing there, only the moon. There is a knock at his door, and, presuming it to be St. John, the narrator says to come in. Instead, he just hears an eerie laugh behind the door. Going to the hall with a candle, he finds nothing. Convinced that someone is in the house, the narrator wakes St. John and they commence a search. St. John believes it to be a thief, while the narrator says it is some enemy that desires to toy with them. They hear noises coming from inside their morbid study, host to their collection of macabre plunder. Opening the door, they are suddenly engulfed by a cacophonous whirlwind. Skulls, books, and various artifacts are tossed about, and a voice shouts at them from the maelstrom. Then, as suddenly as it began, it is gone. Given that the voice was speaking Dutch, the 2 grave robbers are quick to connect it to their latest venture. The winged statue remains undisturbed. Hearing a howling outside, St. John rushes out with the narrator in tow. The narrator discovers massive claw marks on a nearby tree. Alarmed, he calls St. John to come back inside. St. John has found tracks, initially assuming them to be a bear, but instead it looks to be a dog of great size. They hear bats and look up. There against the full moon is a huge retreating winged shape amongst a swarm of bats. On another night, the transition isn't very clear about that to be honest, but it must be, St. John is returning home from doing some shopping. On a deserted street, he becomes spooked, possibly by the sound of his own echoing footsteps, dropping his purchases and pulling a gun. He is not at all prepared for what he sees. The great winged beast looms over him. Back in the mansion, the narrator hears a shot and a scream. Rushing outside, he finds St. John clinging to life, having been savaged by the beast. His face has been sliced to ribbons by its claws. He's able to croak about, "that damned thing," and "the amulet," referring to the statue, before expiring in the narrator's arms. A shadow looms over them. but when the narrator takes up St. John's gun and looks, there is nothing there. The narrator buries St. John, leaving the Necronomicon on his grave. He burns their ghoulish collection, save for the statue. This he packs away with him and takes back to Holland, where he checks into an inn in Rotterdam. After an evening spent out drinking, the narrator returns to find that he has been robbed, including the statue, much to the thieves' misfortune. The thief thought the statue would fetch a fine price, but shortly something attacked him and his compatriots. When found in the morning, they were all butchered in much the same way St. John was. The narrator is drawn out by the cries of horror from those who discovered the grisly scene. Upon seeing the face of one of the bodies as it is carried out by the authorities, he immediately realizes what must have happened. Seeing his stolen suitcase, he convinces the police that it is his by matching the name on it to his papers. The small statue is missing, however. Stealing his resolve, the narrator arms himself and goes out with a shovel to that grave he had disturbed with St. John. He begins to dig and is assaulted by a flock of birds. They scratch his face and he knocks a few away with the shovel. Finally, he unearths the wooden coffin. Instead of the near-skeletal remains from before, a black mass writhes in the coffin. As the narrator leans in with his torch, it proves to be a mass of bats, filling the inside of the coffin to the brim. The bats swarm up into the night sky, and the narrator stumbles back. Within the coffin, the winged statue sits upon the chest of its occupant, right where they found it last time. The body is no longer skeletal and decayed, still gaunt but fleshed out as if only recently deceased. Its eyes open and begins to rise from its grave, hand outstretched towards the narrator. A howl rips through the air. The narrator fled, though he has no memory of how he escaped from that situation. Returning to London, he has attempted to conceal himself in the poor quarter, hoping to hide from the thing in the grave. Despite this, he knows there can be no escape. He hears the baying of hounds and the flapping of wings. A sinister shadow falls over him. He unholsters his gun and puts it to his temple. There is no escape, and it is pointless to run any further. A single shot rips through the London night. And thus ends our story. Alright, this is another not-so-well-regarded Lovecraft story. I own a volume collecting a lot of Lovecraft works, and this one was not included. Lovecraft apparently came to hate the story, calling the Hound a dead dog and a piece of trash. It's been described as too closely mimicking the style of Edgar Allan Poe, one of Lovecraft's major influences. I can definitely see that, and personally I think the way the story was written in a very overly Baroque style did not help. It is very short, and while it does describe some compelling imagery, there just isn't much to this story. A pair of bored young men with some alarming hobbies rob the wrong grave and get haunted by a supernatural force. It's a pretty basic concept, and Lovecraft doesn't do a lot with it that would make it stand out. I do find it a bit interesting, as it seems like Lovecraft taking on a traditional vampire story. The way the corpse at the end is described in the story is even more blatant than in this adaptation. It actually has fangs and is caked in blood when the narrator opens the coffin. It's also specified that the hound-like howling at the end is coming from the body, so it seems the thing in the grave is rising up and transforming into this monster. Considering I've been doing Hellsing reviews this month, I can definitely see the vampire parallels. As for the adaptation, it does its best to bring to life some of the compelling imagery described in the story, but I don't think it manages to elevate the material as much as the Temple adaptation did. There's just not as much to work with. It also doesn't do a great job with passage of time. especially in the transition from the characters watching the monster fly away to St. John out on his own at night. It should be a different night, but it's not very clear and rather abrupt. I mentioned it earlier, but the fact that the statue just looks like a lion with wings rather than a hound does bother me. It's the title of the story, so I can't help but think of how much it doesn't look like a dog every time it comes up. I suppose one issue with both versions of the story is just how unrelatable the protagonists are. These are two very weird young men, wealthy enough to live in a mansion and not having to work, so bored with their lives they've taken up grave robbing as a hobby. They somehow manage to be distractingly unrelatable because the whole story hinges on their fixation with dead things. It's a bizarre thing to premise your plot on. I guess as a short ghost story, it's fun enough, and the art is great as usual from Go Tanabe. It just isn't likely to be anyone's favorite. Lovecraft fans may take note of this as the first Lovecraft story to feature the Necronomicon, but I think that's the only notable point. I think that's all I have for now. There will be one more Lovecraft story coming this month on Halloween, along with a little surprise. Until then, I hope you have a nice day.